I have to say, these are amazing people. I know we're going to have a really robust discussion. And it's, I think, really emblematic of the times that we have some hard problems. It's a challenging time in the world right now, but we also have some people that are digging in, coming up with amazing solutions and leveraging technology to do that. So I'd love to have each of the panelists maybe give us a little bit of their background and what they're passionate about, and then we'll launch into a discussion about different aspects of healthcare that's being facilitated, enabled, and accelerated by the application of AI technology. David, why don't you start?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you all for inviting me. This is a topic that I also hold very near and dear to my heart. I believe that technology can be used to help improve care for everybody, and specifically in those rural and underserved communities. And we know we have a lot of challenges. And because of those challenges, it's going to require more than technology. It's going to require public-private partnerships. And a lot of what I do is I help bring together a lot of stakeholders to help solve issues. And what we've learned during the pandemic is that the best type of partnerships involve, of course, from the point of view of the existing infrastructure, healthcare organizations, payers, but also public health. We also need to engage people who are very close to the individuals, really understand their problems, the community-based organizations, the nonprofits, and the groups that work in many ways hand in hand with the individuals. And then, of course, the individuals themselves. And if we can bring these stakeholders together in ways that care is made easier, more accessible, we can solve a lot of these problems. And we've demonstrated that in, I'd say, smaller examples, but we may be able to scale this if we had the right momentum. And now's the time to do it.
Fantastic. Susan, why don't you give us...
All right. Yes, and I want to thank this organization and this conference, the planners, for including me. I feel a little bit honored to be able to share my perspective as a senior executive who works for the Department of Veterans Affairs. As you may imagine, people who are left still working for the Department of Veterans Affairs are folks that are really passionate about the work that we do. About a third of our employees in our organization are veterans themselves. Any veterans in the audience? A couple of people, thank you. Thank you for your service. How about family members? Ooh, now we're getting increasing numbers also, and caregivers as well. So in my job, my role, and I've been in the organization a long time, as you can hear, as I describe what I've done, hopefully will demonstrate over this session the passion that I have for really delivering better veteran care, starting many years ago in academia and at the Cleveland VA as a primary care frontline caregiver, leading care teams and a lot of work around diabetes or complex care. And then about 10 years ago, worked in leading national primary care programs, and then specialty care programs. And then I was the lead for access to care for 5 years. And after I was exhausted from doing that, because there's never enough access, right? I ended up in the office that I am now. That office oversees research, and we have about $1 billion that the Congress gives us to spend on research for veterans. And then health professions training. 70% of physicians have trained at a VA medical center. And then the innovation group, which is the one that I honestly am having the most fun with over the last 3.5 years. That's what I'm excited about. That's what I'm passionate about. And that has led me into some new work around value-based care that I'll touch on, and a lot of cohesion to collaboration opportunities. But I am going to actually hold on my slide, okay? But I will say, in full disclosure, we are a Microsoft organization, so I've already pitched to David about some opportunities. I'll stop there and turn it over to you all. So I'm giving that perspective of someone who has to take a lot of the innovation and technology and make that work for the clinical teams, patients, family members, veterans, obviously caregivers.
Fantastic. Susan, you do such amazing work, and when you mentioned the budget that the VA has and the large population that you support, I view it as an opportunity for us to do some, and I know you're doing some pioneering work in moving things forward, leveraging AI technology.
Yep.
David, now that we have your slides, do you want to speak to them at all? Or?
Yeah, sure. I'll give you a little background in terms of some of the work that I've been involved in. You heard a little bit about in the background, but when the pandemic hit, I was fairly new to Microsoft at the time, and they were still trying to figure out whether or not this was just a local thing in China. So we have employees in Wuhan, China. They were getting sick, very sick. And I also am an infectious disease physician. So they said, well, hey, we have an infectious disease doc. He's our global chief medical officer. Maybe he can help. So I got on the phone and I was talking to them, and it sounded really bad. I was thinking to myself, oh man, I'm not sure if this is going to continue to spread, because they were talking about it spreading within Wuhan. And sure enough, we started getting phone calls literally that day from other folks in other parts of the region. And then within a week, our team in Italy was getting really sick, and then within that next week, it hit to Seattle. And so, as you can imagine, my role moved from helping support one site to all of a sudden supporting the world. And what we learned during that time was that there were so many needs that were changing constantly. The first need was around communication. And we realized that people just didn't have the right information. They were making bad decisions. They were all rushing to the ER, rushing to the hospitals. The lines were incredibly long. So the hospitals were systems couldn't take care of the sick people because all the worried people were getting there. Now, it's understandable, but there was no mechanism. And so triage was a critical component. And I'm actually starting to see that again and again, that triage is becoming a big part of this. The second thing that we started realizing was that a lot of the data that was needing to be captured needed to be streamlined. We were running into major issues at the time. A lot of hospitals and the lack of PPE, ventilators, and beds was extremely difficult. And people were rushing to the traditional hospitals, and they were finding that they couldn't get serviced. So we actually had to start thinking about how do we allocate resources to areas in a more appropriate manner. And so this whole thing about resource allocation and supply chain became a major thing. And so I became a little bit of a supply chain expert at the time, just purely out of need. And then the whole concept of, well, could we be more proactive and could we better understand it? And that's when the WHO and CDC started saying, hey, we need to start pulling together the data into a way that we can actually manage this. And so we got involved in a lot of those programs. So a lot of my work was really done on the back end. But then in the state of California, because we were tracking all the deployments with the vaccinations, we hit I'll call it a plateau, around 60% or so in terms of vaccination rates. The state could not budge. We were fast to 60, but then we couldn't get past that. And it was not because of lack of availability, it was because of lack of trust. The people who needed the information and needed the vaccines didn't trust the people delivering them, or they didn't have access to it. Like they were uninsured. So we started rolling out programs where we moved the information to literally to where they're at. The migrant farm workers, we brought vaccinations to the workplace. And the way that it worked was, it wasn't just us pulling up in a van, we had to talk to the employers. You talk to the employers and get them on board, and this is what I meant by public-private partnerships. Through those programs, we could then enable trust through the employers to the employees that they could take time off from lunch and get the vaccinations. Then we started expanding to the families. And so this is how these type of programs start working, and it really struck me as this is an example of one of the rare instances during a crisis where we can actually do a lot of good. The sad news is that all the great learnings that we had during the pandemic have now quickly been pushed aside, and we don't have any of those programs in place anymore. But we're starting to reinvigorate that with some of these other new funding sources. So I think we've learned a lot. We haven't necessarily applied it at scale, but it's something that we could actually apply if we were to continue to remind ourselves of the great success we had.
Well, and you mentioned trust several times, and I think that as we design AI systems to support these initiatives, you've pointed out that it's a key part of what we have to build is ways to trust the information, trust the applications, trust the minions that will be supporting what we're doing.
Right.
I also want to echo real thanks to participate in this conference here. I've learned a ton. I come from the chemistry and sort of translational medicine side of things. I didn't know hardly anything about AI till a year ago when I got the opportunity to join Numerian Labs. And really our aspiration is to be the first superpowered AI drug hunter. I'll tell you a little about what that means if you move to the next slide. In the pharmaceutical and biotech business where we're inventing molecules, there's a phrase that's kind of sprung up called a drug hunter. And the analogy here is like finding a drug that's even suitable for clinical testing, let alone going into the clinic, it's like a hurdle race. Think of 10 different hurdles you have to jump over. They're largely uncorrelated with each other. So the risk of tripping up on any one of them, you can get good at that, but it doesn't help you jumping over the next one. A lot of technologies, including AI, come into the drug discovery business and think, well, I can take one of your hurdles out, so I'm going to radically transform your chances of success. And it's really a 50 hurdle race, but call it 10 to make the math easy. If you take one of those hurdles out, you still have 9 points of risk, and so you've reduced the chance of failing by 10%. If you've run that race a bunch of times and you can just a little better jump off, a little better clearing landing, you can drop the risk of failing any one of those by 5%. That almost doubles your chance of getting to the end and not making it there. So that's what a drug hunter is. That's what I am. I've been in the invention and clinical development of drugs for 35 years more now. I stopped counting. With a few, exciting drugs to my name that I've helped to contribute to, and lots more in clinical testing still. But that's kind of an old school way. Well, look at a bunch of gray hair and get people who've done it a bunch. There clearly is a role for AI, but it's not to transform it at all. And we've heard a lot about keeping people involved in the loop. But so we kind of partnered up people, with myself and my board member, Mike Varney. We've partnered up with people who are really come from a machine learning type experience to try to improve the chance of success. People talk about accelerating timelines. It's really more about, I think, improving the chance that you get to the finish line and you have a drug that goes to the clinic and that drug actually gets FDA approval ultimately for marketing. So if you go to the next slide, I kind of described what the problem here is and the opportunity as well. So the key benefits are patients would generally rather take an oral drug. So I work in organic chemistry area. That means what we call a small molecule. You can swallow a pill. If you only have to get injection once a year, people probably, hey, give me the one once a year, maybe every 6 months. But most people would rather take an oral pill. We also know they're vastly cheaper to make, and we know that there's some science around predicting whether the drug will work or not from just looking at the chemical structure. And I described this hurdle race. If you finally get to the end, on average, the value of that drug is about $3 billion. The day the FDA says you may start marketing this drug, the NPV of that drug on average is $3 billion. Now, this is a crazy financial model. You will spend $150 to $300 million over 10 years, and you'll almost certainly fail. But if you get there, it's $3 billion. And you can monetize along the way because pharma will come and buy the assets. When they can predict the chance of success with some certainty, they'll probabilize that and pay you something before it's worth $3 billion. So it's a very high risk, very high reward game that we play. And then with a very stringent set of requirements as well. It's partially understood, but very hard to invent a small molecule that is suitable to put in a pill and give to a patient. One, is it safe? Will it treat disease? Will it be better than whatever has been done before? And very few molecules actually make it over the end. About 30 molecules a year. That's not a good year. 20 to 30 the FDA approves. So this is a business with super high risk, but $90 billion of value created every year by the small number of drugs that the FDA approves. So if you go to the next slide, the reason this is such a difficult problem is the scale of chemicals. So I'm going to take you back to organic chemistry for a minute. If you ask how many molecules fit the laws of organic chemistry and are about the right size to be potentially a drug, it's about 10 to the 60th. That's one with 60 zeros after it. And just to give a point of scale, if you ask how many stars are in the universe, that's 10 to the 22nd, estimate. So there's another 40 zeros after all the stars in the universe that I could sit and go, well, maybe I should make this molecule. No, maybe the one, 5 light years over there. Not all of those do we have any chance of ever making in the life of humanity probably, and not all of them will be good. But there's an estimate there's about 100 billion molecules we should be thinking about every time we're saying, well, what molecule should I make next to invent a drug? Humankind in its entire history, and that's basically 200 years of organic chemistry, has made about 10 million compounds. So we're missing 4 orders of magnitude here that no one's ever made, no one's ever tested. And the drugs that are approved by the clinic, small molecules, about 3,000. So that's another, several orders of magnitude. So that's the scope of the problem. That's the economics and the challenge too. If you want to improve healthcare with a pill that somebody can take, that's the scale. So if you go to the next slide, it's been understood for a long, long time, increasing the chance of success, the best way to do that is to have a lot of chemical diversity at the beginning of your program. And so by chemical diversity, I mean this molecule looks different from the other one. It doesn't have the same physical properties, it's a different shape. And there's two things that happen. If you have very disparate starting points, you have different trajectories towards this valuable molecule. You also find as you go a little forward, you can often do what we call ligand hopping. You can take a piece from this stream and a piece from that stream and start a new stream. So chemical diversity is the most important thing that you want. But this is chemical diversity, again, in those 100 billion molecules that you should be thinking about. So there's some critical requirements here. You need accurate predictions outside. I've told you, humankind has only got to 0.01% of the chemical space that we think is most relevant. So you have to have a prediction outside of distribution, right? You can't just train on existing molecules and think you can go out. So you need a model that will be able to do that. You also need to be going very quickly. I'll get in a minute why speed is so important. And then you want a generative approach. Nobody has even thought of those 100 billion molecules yet. You could start writing them down. But you want the computer to propose molecules and then think about them. And so, we've built a technology suite that I think addresses each of those needs. There are various other methods people are putting together, but we don't think any other method or sets of methods really addresses all of those. So I'll try to finish up in a couple of slides here quickly, but if you go to the next one, I won't go into each of these models, but we have three different models. Cosmos is our foundation model, and I've heard, foundation models, they go out of date within 4 months, and they're just the ticket to the dance. They're not hardly, they're not worth that much anymore. In chemistry, it's still quite a case. So again, if you're talking about a foundation model that is aware of 10 to the 60th molecules and can accurately capture 100 billion molecules, that's way, way harder than any large language model or anything else that I think has been done yet because of the complexity of organic chemistry. And then I mentioned speed. You want to be able to go quickly. And then as you get later in programs, you need to integrate multiple disparate streams of information to actually say, that's a drug I should file with FDA to take into human testing, and that's our third module, Expo. The next slide just has a little bit of comparison if there are any benchmark drug discovery experts in the audience, but there's a set of standard benchmarks that people use to compare how they're doing. And there are a couple of methods. Boltz 2 was published by MIT about 5 months ago. Huge buzz on what's called co-folding. You might have heard of AlphaFold, where computers can now predict protein structures almost as accurately as you can determine their structures exactly. And people have taken that into a prediction mode as well. But the problem is speed and getting outside of known chemistry space. And so you can see we're doing as well. The predictive axis is on the x-axis here, and we're doing as well as these methods that are far, far slower than what we do. I just have two more slides here. One is on Apex itself. So this is a collaboration that we just released last week or 2 weeks ago with NVIDIA to go as fast as you possibly can. So we understand how organic synthesis works. We factor that into our computer searching algorithm, and we're able to test that 100 billion molecule space on a speed. And this is what I think is really important. We're not trying to replace the medicinal chemist. She or he has done lots of experience here. We're trying to enable them to think more quickly and to think differently. So what we want to do is have a computer sample through 100 billion molecules, put the best 100 answers in front of a chemist, and have them repose their question. Because all the time you go, okay, well, I always say I'm a lot smarter after I see the data than before I've seen the data, right? So let me cheat, let me look at the data, and then a new question pops. Oh, well, what if I change this? Oh, okay, that's great, but now I want to change that. Now I want to change this. We can now do this at a speed that is at the speed of human intuition and creatively put proposed answers in front of chemists, their brains, and have their brain interact with that information. And I've seen this over 30 years. When you can get at that attention span, the creativity just blossoms. And so, again, we're not trying to use a computer to replace that chemist. We're trying to enable the chemist to think more creatively, to get outside of ranges where they weren't previously. And the last slide is just a little promo about speed and cost. So you can see we run this Apex method that NVIDIA helped us develop. And we can do that, billions of molecules in 30 seconds. That's the speed interaction of it, and it costs a penny to do that. We then go back with that's a distilled model, so-called. Then we go back with the foundation model, run the top 1 million compounds through there, and that may take some time and dollars. But if you compare that to the other methods that were up there, no other method can compete at the speed and the cost to enable that creative interaction with chemists.
Oh. Well, thank you. That is fantastic. It's a great example of applying AI to address some really significant problems. I'd like each of you to maybe share with our audience some examples of success that you've seen using AI technology within your zone. And then maybe we can talk about some of the concerns that you have about and challenges that maybe some of the people in this room can help address for you.
Yeah, so maybe if you've been to a doctor's office recently, you probably know that a lot of doctors are starting to use something called ambient voice, which is also an extraordinary technology. I think a lot of people thought of this as just a transcription tool, but what it does is it allows you to be able to take an entire voice conversation and convert it into a structure that is very familiar for the doctor, which is the progress note or the history and physical. And when we first did this, we thought, wow, this is pretty amazing. And then we realized that there's a lot more complexity to it because the patients themselves, they have different languages that have to be spoken and different dialects. And then there's a variety of different structures that need to be integrated into, whether it's electronic health records and other formats. And so this has become something that now has become, with the generative AI, one of the fastest growing applications in all of healthcare. If you kind of look at where investments are going, and they've gone, and a lot of interest, this has probably been the one use case that's gotten the most amount of attention. But if we stop there, I think we'd be underappreciating the real value, because now what we have is an ability to capture information digitally from our environment. And so there's a few things that we're starting to see being applied, one of which is we can actually apply on that same voice two things. One, an analysis of the voice itself, and two, an analysis of the text or the words that were said. So with regard to the voice, there are companies that are using the way that a person speaks to identify things such as stress, depression, and anxiety using the voice biometrics. And they're not even looking at the words, they're just looking at how you say it. With 30 seconds, having a person talk about anything, you can find a lot about whether or not they're actually depressed, stressed, or anxiety. And we're starting to see this being deployed not only as a screening tool for individuals, patients, but also measuring burnout in a lot of the clinicians. So it's really an interesting way to quantify and identify. There's a lot of work that's also being done in terms of the actual text itself. And I'd say one of the areas that is really exciting is that we can actually improve the quality of care, and we can also potentially improve the efficiency of care. One of the quality measures is when a person is talking to a patient, they may not realize that perhaps the patient needs to have certain types of things to meet certain quality standards, concordance with guidelines. And there are quality guidelines that everyone knows about, like vaccinations and doing all the things that are part of HEDIS measures. But there are things that people don't necessarily realize. So one of the things that we've seen is in cancer care, patients very often get placed on a chemotherapy regimen. But they completely, like this whole area of precision medicine is completely pushed to the side. And in fact, there isn't an analysis of the biomarkers. And then even when the biomarkers are identified, there isn't concordance with the treatment with the biomarkers, which is extraordinarily problematic because the probability of success with the chemo regimen is typically far worse than that of a precision medicine treatment. And so if we actually knew that this had a tumor that had these specific biomarkers that was associated with a particular treatment, the patients would benefit from that. The reality is a lot of clinicians are just in the mode of cancer, chemo, cancer, chemo. And so I think we're starting to realize that there are gaps, a lot of gaps and variations in care that can be addressed. We're also starting to see how individuals can now, with that type of information, develop what are called real-time prior authorizations. So both with the conversation that is being said, in terms of looking to see, does it match what the payers are looking for, so you don't have to go do that back and forth. But also, you can also look into medical record and determine, did the person fail the first-line treatment in other areas? So that's a huge time saver for not only the clinician, but also the patient. I don't know if you've ever been involved in a scenario where you're waiting to see if the payer will approve a particular treatment, and sometimes it gets approved and sometimes it doesn't. It may last weeks, months. I mean, it's a problem. But that could be addressed real time. And so these are the types of things that we're starting to see, and it all is facilitated by the fact that we've digitized this. And I've only talked about voice, but we're now starting to do the same thing in computer vision. And so there's extraordinarily a lot of room ahead for us to do some amazing things.
We'll come back a little bit later to talk about some of the aspects of privacy and security that are relevant to that. But Susan, let's hear what you're excited about.
So I feel compelled to respond a bit to ambient and what our experience is. So it's like the old point counterpoint, from Saturday Night Live. But so what is it like to be a healthcare system and to say we're going to look at what are all the companies out there and to acquire a product that gets implemented in the system? And so our journey started about 2 years ago. I actually led that journey initially. The AI group was under me for a little bit less than a year. And we did something that many of you probably don't know that's called a tech sprint. That is under the authority of a challenge.gov authority, and we are able to bring companies together and compete them for prize money. That is something that we still have the authority to be able to do. So the next great challenge is out there. If any of you want to end up telling me this is maybe something that we really in the VA should be doing. But we had about 150 companies, and over 5 months got down to the top 6 companies. And Microsoft was in that list, and ended up then using simulation that the company tested their product on our system, but we also then, through simulation, had a copy of the product and tested it with our end users. So I bring that into the equation. I've used the product, and the product has a lot of kind of what we say face validity, right? You use it and you're like, okay, yeah, this does definitely make sense at first take. But there are ways to look at technologies and have different companies that are using those technologies to compete them and to find what is the best product for your own organization. So I think that's something unusual that I wanted to bring forward that the government can do. So we did end up with 2 companies and have those companies implementing at 11 sites. I know you're foreshadowing a little challenge that you might bring up, so I'll just touch lightly on how long it took to get a contract with those 2 companies. Was definitely a challenge, but it is spreading. There's a lot of value in that, the ambient scribe product. And the one thing I'm curious about that you mentioned, David, is that you can add in guideline concordant care, which 100% I agree with. Some of the product components where I've talked to some of the companies to add in quality measures in there is related more to billing. And that is, as I am leading an effort around value-based care for our organization, and we want to look at better outcomes for the unit of cost, I think that we're going to converge a little bit into how we think about quality measures. I'll just sidebar quickly around quality measures and AI so I don't forget the opportunity to really take a cadre of measures that probably aren't really meeting the needs of patients and representative of what are good clinical outcomes. And in addition to patients' input, we have an opportunity to use AI to change what those outcomes are and really look at it related to the unit of cost. I know that some folks from Microsoft are on the National Academy of Medicine group that I'm on, looking at it, then how that is related to payment. And I do think you've touched on this. We're leaning further back into how do we do things as a better product, like a business. With CMS is doing that with the Rural Health Challenge and what they're asking us to look at and do in government entities to drive better health care. It's like a business. What are we getting? Do we really find that what we're getting in health care is the best it can be for the cost? And I think many of us would probably say no right now, but that is truly our opportunity to use technologies and innovations to drive that to a better state in the collective, everyone here in the audience.
I wonder if we're entering an era of going beyond just the data that's in the EMR to come up with more functional outcomes in terms of people's individual goals and their quality of life, as opposed to, we treated this disease, it took this much time to do it and this much expense, but something on top of that in terms of more functional evaluation of the impact of new technologies.
And I think that we call them and have called them more patient-reported experience measures, and I don't think that we've really used them to really like we could use them. They're difficult to capture and incorporate into a measure set, right? But those are the opportunities that I see with the way for the VA and healthcare writ large, and to drive healthcare to a better way forward, as you just pointed out.
Yeah, one thing that we should always keep in mind, think of AI as a coin. We oftentimes focus on the amazing models and the capabilities of the models, but on the flip side are the data. And the data are necessary not only for the development of the models, but also the validation and the ongoing monitoring. And the data sets themselves are oftentimes very limited, both in terms of their ability to be usable, whether they're well curated, fully annotated, linked into appropriate terminologies, to the fact that they're oftentimes unimodal, just one type of data set. And so what you're alluding to is the need for us to think about multimodal data sets that are well curated, that have longitudinal outcomes associated with it. And if we could actually build those data sets, we could have an ability for us to be able to not only develop better models, but we could use that as a means for further testing and validation. I feel like the journey on the AI side has gone very fast and has been getting a lot of attention. The data side is that dirty side that no one really pays attention to, but it's going to slow everything down if you don't actually have that. And I think the case in point would be if you had a model that you wanted to apply in your own institution or even in another country, then you have to know that model is going to work on your patient population. So there has to be a testing done and a monitoring piece. And if you don't have that capability, you're in a very difficult scenario, because then you're just basically hoping that this model will work. And that is not a good strategy.
Well, David, the rural healthcare initiative that you described, and Susan, the largest unified healthcare network in the U.S. that you help manage, are going to be generating so much data. And so David, to your point, the data is going to be really, how we handle this opportunity with the data is going to be really interesting. And Steve, I'm curious, you've described a very powerful way to improve our efficacy of coming up with new therapeutic interventions through small molecules. Is there ever a feedback loop in terms of this was tried, this was brought to market, and then the data that groups like David's and Susan's might have access, does that come back and help you inform your direction?
Yeah, well, I would say we hope to get there. There is not a drug on the market today that people who are being objective would say is an AI-derived or even AI-inspired drug yet. And that's partly because of how long it takes and the failure rates. I am confident that we're 10 years into a 20-year process. The first drugs that are, truly everybody says, okay, that's an AI drug by, chemists say, okay, yeah, the computer really helped invent that, are in phase 2 trials right now. And the first approvals for probably psoriasis first will be in another 2 to 3 years. Right now, if you add up everything, there's only about 1% of the drugs that are in clinical trials today are even AI-derived, because it just takes a long time to invent a drug and early trials are slow. But it's growing phenomenally. It's growing 7 or 8% a year. So 10 years from now, almost every molecule that goes into clinical testing will be AI-derived.
Well, and I imagine that clinical testing is being enhanced by AI technology.
And that's a separate area so I talked a lot about organic chemistry then, and
I know people were smiling when you said organic chemistry.
They loved it. Yeah, so good. So and I'm horrified to hear what David said. So I spent the last 10 years of my life inventing oncology drugs that have very specific target patient populations. To know that that's not the way it's practiced, when I always tell people, not to be a snob, but go to a tertiary medical center, go to Stanford, go to UCSF. If your friend has cancer, send them to a place where they do molecular tumor boards and immunology now as well. So there absolutely is a feedback already. We use it in the discovery process because all of the predictions are recorded, and then the subset that we experimentally test. Of course, you learn the most when you thought it would work and it didn't work. If you think it will work and it works, that's not as discriminating as, boy, the computer really thought that molecule was going to be good. I bought into it. I was excited about it. Dud. So you can't factor that in. And we absolutely will factor in clinical data as well. What we mentioned, improving the efficiency of clinical trial, I think the most important thing there, both from a provision of medical care and an ethical point of view, and from the company's point of view is get the right patients in the trial. So right now we enroll a group of patients, and we hope that it works in 30% of them. Maybe it'll be 50%. Oncology got better, biomarker-driven trials. If you have this mutation, take the drug. If you don't have this mutation, don't take the drug. And response rates jump to 70 or 80%. So that kind of defining the patient group who should be in your trial is already moving, and that will be done with AI, both external real-world experience and the molecular markers and all the information you collect on that patient will disaggregate and then reaggregate patient groups based on that will improve the predictive power, and then trials should get shorter. They'll be cheaper to run because you're not triple time over enrolling trials, so you can measure an effect size. So
all of you have described.
I was going to comment on data for a moment, as our healthcare system keeps very high levels of very longitudinal data. Usually veterans that are eligible and enroll in the VA stay there for a long time. It's an opportunity there. And I wonder what you, Walter, and my colleagues would say about data outside of the electronic health record. I know that you and I have had a lot of discussions about wearables and immersive experiences, but I also think about healthcare-related experiences where patients or veterans from us are showing up at, and getting meds at CVS, or going to urgent clinics that are not affiliated with their healthcare systems. Mm-hmm. And I think that if we're really driving to the best healthcare outcomes, that we need to include those data, and those are some of the discussions I've heard moving around a little bit and have not really seen any solutions. And I'm wondering what you think perhaps the opportunity is for AI to help us further with that.
Yeah, and I was alluding this to in my presentation. I think there is a certain amount of information that we can gather when we know a person has a disease, and there's strategies we can deploy and leverage those and optimize it. But my concern is all those patients that did not come into the system and come in so late into the game. Yeah. And is there a way that we can find them earlier? I call them ticking time bombs, because in many cases they come in with really bad disease. When we did this program, and this retinal screening program, we've done this throughout the country. In Texas, East Texas, the first 50 patients that were screened, 1/5 of them, 20% of them, had moderate to severe diabetic retinopathy requiring urgent evaluation. And the average hemoglobin A1C in this group was 10.5%. That's just the average. And to give you a sense, we're talking diabetes out of control. These are individuals of the next 3 years that will, 1, lose vision, and 2, either have a heart attack or stroke. Because they're on the path. They're basically not that cannot be sustained. We're picking up patients that have blood pressures of 180, 190 systolic, walking around. Those individuals, if we don't pick them up before they come in, they will have catastrophic events. And that's our opportunity. If you think of it from a cost perspective, 5% of the population is responsible for 50% of the total cost of care. 20% of the population is responsible for 80%. The problem is by the time they present, they're already down that slippery slope. We have to get them before they get the event, well before, so we can modify those lifestyle behaviors, so we can intervene, we can provide the treatments. And to me, that's where we now have newer technologies that are non-invasive, easily accessible, and can be used for, I call it pre-screening, because we don't want to necessarily, we're identifying the individuals, but what we're doing is we're filtering out the population, saying, hey, you know what? I'm going to send people to call you and make sure that you get to see the doctor, because you haven't seen the doctor in 5 years. And I know it's difficult, but it's going to be a challenge, and we're going to make it easier for you. We're going to do the ride share. We're going to invest our money, and we've learned that programs like food as medicine, transportation services, when applied to that group of patients, it's totally worth it if you're looking at the outcomes over a longer period of time. And that's what we have to start thinking about, redefining our strategies.
I completely agree with that, and as the leader of a legislatively mandated, air quote, value-based care program, we're leaning in and aligning to exercise as medicine, and really leaning into and CMS is on board with that as well, to shift populations of patients before they really get full-blown diabetes to the left, for better health and for better cost and better, lives for those around them. So couldn't agree more.
The theme for this panel discussion is urgent needs, powerful tools, ethical constraints. So we haven't talked much about the ethical constraints. What we have talked about is the power of big data, the power of being able to measure everything, the power of being able to do predictive modeling and empowering new development and new tools. But what are the constraints that we have to be careful about? I have some ideas, but I'd rather hear it from the panel.
We talk to a lot of organizations, and everyone says, oh, responsible AI, that's the answer. So if you look at the responsible AI principles, there's a lot of them, and they're all important. Transparency, explainability, value, mitigating bias, you name it. The question is, what are you as an organization going to do to implement that? And when it gets to that point, then we realize, oh, they don't have the processes in place. There's 5 things that every organization needs to do if they want to implement responsible AI. The first is you have to understand what AI is running in your system today. There has to be a registration process. There has to be a mechanism to do an inventory. And this is what led to the whole concept of those cards. I forget what the name of those. The model cards, which allows you to be able to, in a structured way, capture information. And that's great. So now you have a registry. You understand. The question is, are you going to do all AI? Because AI is actually embedded in every single thing. So you're going to have to kind of figure out, maybe it's just clinical AI and things like that are third party, but irrespective. That's the first. The second question, which is really a 2-component, is, are you testing those models on your own local data sets before deployment? Because the reality, as I mentioned before, the models were tested on other people or other data, and it may not or may not be applicable. And that testing does not usually occur. Now, when it does occur, the second piece, which is, I guess, number 3, are you monitoring? And because we know AI drifts, we know that it changes over time. We know the populations change. We know that the data sets and definitions change. And when that happens, the outcomes change. And we've seen this. And the other thing is that we know that is not something that is done routinely. It requires a lot of effort. The fourth thing, which is also really important, is the whole issue of bias. Now, there's bias in the models, but there's also bias in how it's implemented, and there's bias in terms of how it's disproportionately impacting populations, in particular vulnerable, underserved, disenfranchised populations. And so unless you actually specifically look how it was rolled out, in many cases we've seen that well-intentioned AI actually doesn't get implemented the way that people thought it would be, and that the people get less access to care that need it the most. And that whole issue has become a major factor that needs to be addressed. You need teams around it, you need processes, and the last is around governance. At some point, somebody has to oversee this, and it has to roll up through a process that's streamlined. And what we found is that organizations that do all 5 of these, they put a lot of people and money in it. It's completely unsustainable. And so we launched something called the Trustworthy Responsible AI Network, because we said, this should not be just for your academic medical center that has a ton of resources, or your large health system that's doing well. It should be for every organization. It should be for the small community clinic. It should be for the rural hospital. And so to do that, we actually have a whole group of folks that are leveraging technology to do it. They're leveraging partnerships so that not one site is doing all of it, but they're sort of like distributing the duties. And then they're also finding ways that the technology companies can do the testing and monitoring. And so it's through that distributed model that we're looking to see if we can make it more efficient. And so that's an ongoing effort. It launched in the US. It's called TRAIN, Trustworthy Responsible AI Network. It was subsequently launched in Europe, and it's going to be launched in LATAM and a bunch of other places. But that's what we're focused on.
And as a large health system, we're participating in TRAIN, and it's really difficult to do all those things. We do have, as a government entity, the inventory, and I have seen companies coming to us about the management and monitoring and looking for drift now is what I'm starting to see bubbling up. But to be continued, and absolutely couldn't agree more with what's needed. But it's a lot of work. You're right.
I'll just comment. So some of the things you were saying, David, we have to do this. So we do monitor our data. We monitor for drift because we'll get the answer wrong, and no one, our molecule will never go to the clinic because we'll run tests and go, okay, that's a complete flop. But that's still within the laboratory and inventing molecules. And so it's I think it's easier. And if care is suboptimal or even inappropriate, there's a huge cost to pay, but maybe the people who didn't make the decisions aren't directly accountable. So we have accountability within our organization. We'll go out of business if we don't do it. But where we'll need to be very careful is we're just moving into clinical trials next year, and we'll define groups of patients that will or will not be in our trial. And as we talked about, that will be AI driven. We'll have to then monitor that and ask, well, are we getting the patients that we believe are right, but also is that getting broadly spread across the entire community, or are there exclusions of groups that have nothing to do with the underlying medicine. It's because they weren't in the training set that was used to define the group that should be in there, or they have some other limitation to access. So my comfort at it's self-reinforcing is going to end in a few months here when we start enrolling patients in clinical trials.
Wow. I'm not sure if I should describe it as a philosophical issue or as an ethical issue. And I'm not sure that there definitely is not one answer. But I will point out that we have a bit of a seesaw situation, where at one end we have the urgent needs that we have. We've talked earlier about an aging population, but there's other healthcare crises. There's a lot of people who are not getting the healthcare they need. David, you did a good job of elaborating some situations where we have barriers to reaching people. So we have urgent needs, and we have ways to get there with powerful solutions. But we also have these, on the other side of the seesaw, we have a reason to go slow, to be careful, to make sure we do it right, that we protect privacy. And there's a balance there. And that balance actually should come down to the individual too. I think an individual needs to have the ability to weigh the risks, maybe not so much for development of new technology or new products, but for their use of them. And whether they want to share their personal data either to help get better healthcare for themselves or for their family or for their community. And I think we do need to make sure we bring in the experts who can help adjudicate and guide us on some of these ethical considerations as we design our products.
Can I comment on the
Please.
feedback loop and on trust? I know some of you were at the Sidekick meeting conversation on stage yesterday and then also today. And it was mentioned that I was involved in one of the Sidekick products. Closing the loop to me and working with the Sidekick organization has been about, inevitably, which we're at the point of now, of getting veterans to test the product that helps to support veterans and information and services that are available, predominantly starting around mental health care. And mental health care needs during the transition out of the military. So to me, that loop of using things with patients and more of a test situation to give that feedback is important. And what I witnessed as someone who had gone through this process before as a physician working in the health system was that the Sidekick organization tried to really break the model and say, okay, can we get it to say something wrong? Can we get it to color outside the lines? And I recall someone who was testing it saying, well, my wife's giving me bad information. Should I just leave her? And the model said, I think that's outside of the scope of what I can say and talk about, and I think you need to talk to somebody, that can help you, but I can't comment on that. And I thought, those kinds of tests and pushing the limits of the technology is needed, and then inevitably testing it with those end users. So we now have over 100 veterans with feedback. It's the Net Promoter Score, right, about the use of these technologies and their feedback, and with a plan to scale that dramatically before we really bring that to full-scale market and delivery to veterans. But to me, thinking about that process, closing that loop is incredibly important, and I wanted to close the loop myself in my experience with Sidekick. So.
Well, and I think it's very germane to the question that of how do we do things with patient involvement in the design and feedback of a process. That's, in my mind, the way to address this ethical dilemma of speed versus and safety, and the trade-offs between impact and the urgent needs that some people have.
Yeah, and it was addressing a problem that we have, and problems need solutions, and encouraging folks to come forward with solutions that address some of our biggest pain points and challenges, like you described during the pandemic. How are we going to do care delivery, better, or account for what's happening and share that information better? So really appreciate that.
So what is the future of data? David, you mentioned it's a fundamental aspect of this, and Susan, you are a key person in one of our largest healthcare networks with data, historical data, but also every moment new data is flowing in from the hundreds of hospitals that are seeing vets. And Steve, your group is looking at all this new you described the billions of possibilities for therapies. So is one of the key enablers as we move forward with AI is to be able to effectively harvest data and put it to appropriate use? And is that how do we manage that, Susan? How do you deal with the treasure chest of data that you have?
It is. I like that treasure chest of data. As I mentioned, CVS, where you get meds, or other organizations where you kind of stop by, but that's still part of what's happening. Many of you may know, and some may not, that we have our direct care system for 9 million veterans, 170 medical centers, over 1,200 additional sites of care. But then we also have an option starting from the Mission Act in 2017-18 time period of expanding into the community. So while normal regular health systems say that's leakage and we want to avoid it at all costs, we're encouraging now to be a payer and a provider of healthcare. So that is an imperative for us to show, to aggregate that data, and looking at large systems, to Microsoft or AWS, and how do we organize that data better, looking at those outcomes, patient experience, and cost. For the first time ever, we're really going to start looking at costs and incentives, because the Congress is nudging us in that direction. So I think that we're going to have to figure it out, and we're going to need some serious help from folks that have been successful.
Maybe some of the people in this room.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think the data right now, we oftentimes think of as structured data, but the real unmet need is the unstructured data sets, which are immense. They're massive. We're talking about voice recordings, we're talking about images, we're talking about streaming videos. All of that requires an incredible amount of infrastructure, and we actually have to start thinking about where that infrastructure resides. Does it reside in one central repository, or does it reside perhaps with the individual themselves? And this is where we actually may start needing to leverage the things that we talk about: federated learning, privacy-preserving secure enclaves, all these things that in the past weren't necessarily top of mind for organizations, but because the data is forcing us to rethink how we manage it, we actually have to think that the only way for this to be scalable is to think about how data can reside where it's at and bringing the models to the data. That's the only way that we can move forward.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to have a few questions from some of the experts in our audience, and hear what you're curious about and what you're excited about too. I do, to David's last point, I've heard over and over again about the ideal scenario for data in healthcare is to also not only give individuals agency over their data, but maybe have them, whenever their data is used to develop a new medical product or improve a medical system, have them get some monetary reward because their data was used as part of that. Yeah.
We tried that at one point, and it's always a question of timing. When we were during the pandemic, we realized that there was an opportunity because people actually had to get their own vaccination data to show whether or not they'd been vaccinated, and that gave us the opportunity to leverage Smart on Fire to pull the entire medical record. So they could be their own steward of their own information. They could go anywhere, and basically through the Fire APIs, they could be like their own HIE. The problem was it became viewed as a political issue around vaccine passports and a variety of other things. So then people said, well, you can't do that. And so we've run into issues that had nothing to do with the technology. It had to do with perceptions. And I think at this point, we're starting to realize that maybe it's time to revisit those assumptions because we're in a different time. We've got different types of opportunities in front of us. And if there's different value that can be created, such as enrollment in clinical trials and other things, we may be able to change the narrative. But the technology hasn't been the issue. It's really been kind of our own acceptance of it.
Well, let's hear some from the audience, but before we do that, any final words from the panel? Or requests or suggestions or
Let's hear some good questions from the audience.
Yeah.
You get some questions out here.
I have a question here. Hi, Walter. So many of the terms you brought up when it came to trust are summarized well by Charles Binkley and Brian Greene. Many of the principles you guys have talked about, in addition to the 5 principles, I think are summarized well by Charles Binkley in his most recent paper that breaks it down to veracity, consent, and confidentiality when using AI in healthcare. And that comes back to the shared agency of the patient, and the patient being a data donor. And so I want to share that out, but also asking the question to the panel here, who are really involved in implementation of healthcare, of how does the addition of AI to the clinical decision-making process impact the doctor-patient relationship? Because now there is a third decision maker in the room that is not another person. But
That's a good question.
Yeah, I can tell you that if it's presented in a way that the patient sees this as a tool that the clinician's using, it's very well accepted. Because the patients don't need to evaluate the AI. They need to know that the healthcare, the physician and the institution have evaluated. And if they think that this tool works, I trust that. That's the reason I'm seeing you as a patient. I don't want you to have to explain to me how an MRI works. If you tell me I need the MRI or you need a certain blood test, I don't even understand what PCR is. But if you tell me I need it, I believe you. And that trust is with the provider. And what we have to do is we have to ensure that the providers and the institutions can trust it, because at that point, it goes back to the patient.
I completely agree with that. It's a tool, and especially veterans have that. Doc, if you have that experience with them, doc, if you tell me that's what I need to do and that's how we're moving forward, then I trust you. It is really about the trust with the relationship with the clinicians team, not just physicians.
Can I just add one thing? So I'm a PhD, not an MD, so I've never treated disease. But it also depends on the doctor, because I've been in offices where the doctor says, I have to now fill out this form because this has been mandated. So the doctor has to believe there's value added, and then they'll transmit that to the patient.
Right.
So if it's imposed on the physician, it's not going to go well. Right.
Good point.
Yes, Tom Vogelsong, angel investor in health tech. And there was an interesting talk this morning about empathy in AI. And I've seen reports where people interact with an AI agent or chatbot versus a doctor, and they prefer the empathy of the AI chatbot. So I was wondering if the panel can talk a little about empathy and other, quote, human factors coming into the agent-patient relationship versus doctor-patient.
Yeah, I know that. I'm very familiar with Jonathan Chen's study and a bunch of others that have looked at this and some of the work at UCSD. So this is, when you use a study design to evaluate performance based on a series of metrics, the computer, the AI model, can do it better than the clinician. Because there are certain things that you have to do. You have to acknowledge the patient. You have to, and sometimes clinicians in their rush to get to the answer, they bypass some of those things. These things that are maybe not viewed as essential, but the AI does it consistently. And because of those things, it is viewed and perceived in writing as more empathetic. The question has always been, does that mean that it is more empathetic? Because empathy is more than just writing responses. It's about how you actually have that direct human interaction. And in those scenarios, we have not yet evaluated, because there isn't really a mechanism for AI to be deployed. But it is definitely doing things that we know should be done better than clinicians are doing it.
I think there are ways to augment that empathy, and I appreciate the call out to that study, but there are ways to engage other healthcare professionals in a team approach, and then also tools to help support patients that I've seen quite a number of outside of the healthcare setting, to be more of that listener and bring it back to the clinician team. So I think we're, in many of the conversations today and yesterday, going to see the combination of technology along with clinicians and clinician teams.
Thanks, Tom. That was a good question.
So I have a question, particularly in biotracking. Earlier I mentioned that I started a company after my cancer recovery that it's technically a telehealth platform with AI, integrated biotracking. And then right now this AI and longevity course is taught by Michael Snyder, whose lab actually verified, smartwatch biotracking had a potential to shift healthcare from real healthcare instead of sick care. But there is, from a business model implementation perspective, like anytime you're adding a device tracking, there's extra cost. Who's carrying that cost? And how do you make the services available continuously for patients, particularly in the underserved community that suffer more from this type of different disease? So I'd love to hear what you guys think, in terms of this particular yours, like AR and VR. That's very exciting, but it's super expensive. Right? Computer vision, super expensive. How do you?
I think smart glasses are on their way, and I think they will scale in the enterprise, and we'll be using them for a lot of things. So you're right, it's expensive now, but also if we can reduce someone's healthcare costs significantly using new technologies, then there's a business model for that.
That's how I think about it. And we're really looking at what the business cases are, and we're going to have to keep leaning in and figuring that out. Yeah, but because the technology that you're mentioning is, helps people get to good, better health. So we're going to have to figure out how to incorporate these.
I hope the panelists will be able to stick around for a little bit after this to answer the additional questions. But I want to thank you. It's a very wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank
thanks
you
very much
very
for organizing.